What was the last thing you saw before it hit and the video ended?
Він мене чув, і він намагався не рухатись, щоб я його не побачив.
What's the feeling when you hit your target?
Відчуття виконаного обов'язку.
This Ukrainian drone pilot is proud of his job. From his command post, located in a classified and highly protected area, the young man guides dozens of silent ships every day that search for Russian troops like relentless bloodhounds.
Is flying free, searching for something to destroy.
Once it detects its target, there's no way to escape from these modern kamikazes. The drone crashes into the victim, tearing it to pieces. Not only that, but it also captures on camera the enemy's final moments, just as the unmanned craft makes contact with its body.
Ти дійсно почуваєш себе птахом. В кінці взривається. Це ж просто неймовірно.
In this new installment of military force, we are going to accompany these 21st century pilots in their brutal hunt from a distance. We warn you that this story does not end well for the Russian soldiers. What you are seeing on screen is a Ukrainian team of drone pilots arriving at their base of operations. The work begins early, before the sun has finished positioning itself in the sky. Darkness is always a desirable cover for these men. Beyond the technology necessary to handle the miniature ships, the essential provision that this group requires are the explosives that transform simple flying machines into destructive machines that detonate upon contact with a target. It is not just any weapon. These are devices that allow for stealthy and personalized tracking, almost like trained missiles that obey their master. The Russians can try to hide behind a tree or in the depths of a trench, but in the sky of Ukraine there are kamikaze lookouts ready to swoop in. The material is shocking, but this is how war is lived in Europe. Unmanned aircraft have gained a reputation as the spearhead for Kyiv's troops, and the results speak for themselves. Deaths caused by drones have increased exponentially, and their production is becoming increasingly cheaper compared to other, more ostentatious resources, such as missiles or artillery pieces. Among the units that became a reference in this new facet of war, the Achilles Battalion of the 92nd Brigade of Ukraine stands out. Its soldiers are among the most experienced pilots of these hunter aircraft and have professionalized the role to a level never seen before. If there is one thing that this bloody war will leave as a legacy, it is the incredible advance in terms of remote attacks and the unmanned devices that are used in these missions. But not everything is innovation. There is also a large dose of survival and practicality. These pilots had to learn to repair these machines using scarce resources and spare parts from destroyed machinery. The result is a hybrid force that combines the best of technology with human ingenuity. The important thing is not that the device looks elegant or futuristic, but that it is able to enter small nooks and crannies to kill the enemy. This is the point of view of a drone that was directed towards the hiding place of a Russian soldier. This plastic and metal bird entered through a window to annihilate its target. At a safe distance, a second device recorded the moment when the Kremlin's soldier transformed into a cloud of dust. With surgical precision, the hunter entered the abandoned house, finishing off the potential threat in seconds. Another point for the relentless Achilles Battalion. A curious fact is that one of the operational centers of this brigade is an old Russian ammunition warehouse that was captured.
The Achilles Battalion of Ukraine's 92nd Brigade owns it now. So sensitive its location, they won't even tell us where we are on the map.
Since June 2023, propaganda videos presented by both the Ukrainian and Russian defense ministries have had a great impact on expert opinion. These are first-person footage captured by the cameras of drones that armies use to annihilate the enemy, images that create a new and brutal way of understanding and visualizing war. The narrative changes when you can see the exact moment when a machine operated several kilometers away hits a soldier's body and blows it into 1,000 pieces. The videos usually focus on the ships that are used as missiles, the so-called kamikaze drones, which explode upon contact with their target. This can consist of vehicles, radars, bunkers, and, of course, troops that are at the mercy of these silent hunters. But these machines, as automated as they may seem, have a human element that, for the moment, is necessary for their operation. As we mentioned, drone pilots play an increasingly important role in the war. They are highly trained operators to manipulate a hybrid between a miniature aircraft and a missile. Within the Ukrainian force, these positions are coveted for a clear reason. It is a job that is done in relative safety, but which still allows them to make a significant contribution in the fight against the Kremlin, riddling its soldiers at an increasingly accelerated pace. Next, we will accompany one of these mysterious operators as he flies over Andriivka, one of the many towns that were devastated by fighting with Russian forces.
Зараз ми підлітаємо безпосередньо на лінію розмежування. Прямо з FPV-шної камери можете побачити, наскільки тут від землі немає живого місця.
Suddenly, with the help of his team, this young pilot comes across a group of Russians advancing through this ruined and apocalyptic territory. As we previously indicated, when a drone detects you, you can run, but you will never be able to escape.
О, диви, бігають, світяться. Як красиво.
Boom, right on target. The camera screen was covered in black and white stripes, similar to those that used to appear on old tube televisions. The connection was lost, but that was not a bad sign, quite the opposite. It means that the drone successfully exploded in the back of a Russian armored vehicle, blowing the impacted area to pieces. The attack was probably not enough to completely destroy the vehicle, but it was enough to compromise its functionality or even seriously injure its occupants. It is a job well done by the operator, since with a plastic piece worth a few $1,000s, he managed to damage an expensive and tactically important vehicle. Let us pause for a moment on the young man behind the glasses and controls. As you may know, when the Russian invasion began, in February 2022, many people left their daily occupations to join the local resistance force. Professionals, farmers, police officers, and all kinds of workers were transformed overnight into soldiers. They did not have the technical or tactical training, but they did have the desire to fight. This was the case of this young man, only 20 years old, a biology student who earned the nickname Darwin in reference to the famous scientist who postulated the theory of the evolution of species. In some way, he is also part of an evolutionary process, although in the field of war. From surveillance devices to drones that release grenades and, finally, to flying kamikazes. Let's listen to how the young man explains the importance of these systems in the context of the invasion of his country.
Ціль, яка рухається, вважається практично тією, в яку не можна влучити. У нас, якщо ціль рухається, і ми знаходимося над нею, це ніякої ролі не грає.
One of the major complications of this conflict is that the fighting took place both in rural and remote areas, and in large cities full of houses and buildings. The latter is a challenge, as the structures are ideal hiding places for ambushes, snipers, and, today, drone operators. In the case of Ukraine, trying to repel the invader with bombs, missiles, or artillery would also mean destroying its own country. That is why explosive devices are presented as a much more precise option with less collateral damage for Kiev's troops.
Достатньо часто ворогом використовуються багатоповерхові будівлі в якості позиції для роботи. Але із дронами камікадзе, які є у нас, ці укриття перестають бути укриттями.
The problem is that unlike artillery munitions, Ukrainian remote-controlled drones cannot be mass-produced. Instead, they are the result of a fairly artisanal process carried out in government-controlled workshops, although there are also others carried out clandestinely by committed civilians. Each piece is built from available explosives that are then adapted to attack drones. In many cases, shells are taken from old Soviet RPGs and loaded onto plastic parts created using 3D printers. Basic tools, glue, and tape are used. The process may seem primitive, but the result is extremely lethal. As we mentioned earlier, Ukrainian pilots have combined cutting-edge technology with great creativity when it comes to assembling new destructive pieces. What you're seeing on screen is a device called Avada Kedavra. Yes, like Harry Potter's spell. But this drone built from an anti-tank missile charge has nothing magical about it. It is a crucial element to be able to attack the thousands of armored vehicles that the Kremlin has, and which have meant a brutal advantage during its invasion. Let's see this toy in action.
Дуже сильно броньовані, дійсно. Якщо використовувати звичайні боєприпаси, то вибухають вони доволі рідко. З такими штуками вибухають частіше. В порівнянні з артилерією і FPV. Звісно, FPV буде сильно вигравати, це високоточна зброя.
Darwin insists that drones have a great advantage over artillery, and although his assessment may be controversial, since Russia has won several territories using this weapon, the truth is that Ukraine is in a very difficult context. It does not have the industrial capabilities of the Kremlin, and its production is cut short by the advance of the enemy. That is why drones are considered the best option for the troops in Kiev. These small unmanned aircraft have provided excellent results and have caused truly painful losses to the enemy. The most interesting thing is that these capabilities must be attributed both to the technology and to the pilots. People like Darwin, who carry out an impressive job. Seeing his workstation is impressive. The glasses can reach far beyond the limits of his bunker, allowing his mind to traverse the Ukrainian fields as if he were a falcon in full hunt. The controls generally resemble those used in video games. On the one hand, they are cheaper, but there is also a practical reason: the motor memory of many of the young operators. Because before the war, they were frequent users of these game consoles. The hellish context of the Russian invasion has allowed them to use the skills gained through years of gaming in a task that is not at all fun, but is very necessary for their country.
Плюс. Відпрацювали.
But beyond the distance and detachment that comes from fighting through checkpoints, Ukrainian soldiers are well aware that this is not a game. They understand that there are lives at stake, both their own and others, and that they must act with this enormous responsibility in mind. Let's listen to the reflections of Darwin, the star pilot of the Achilles Battalion of the 92nd Brigade of Ukraine.
Does it feel like a video game?
Ні, це не відчувається як відеогра, відчувається як змагання за власне життя і власну територію.
How many targets have you been able to hit?
За весь час скільки?
Do you keep score?
Ні.
Despite the interviewer's insistence, Darwin says that he does not keep track of the number of attacks he has carried out since the beginning of the conflict. Although it may seem strange, since we are used to snipers keeping a detailed record of the number of lives they have eliminated, you must bear in mind that the role of the drone pilot is different. His job is routine, tense, and he must use all his concentration in each of the flights, since the units that are put into service are difficult to build, and a wasted drone is a great material loss for Ukraine. He cannot be thinking about past or future cases, he must be focused on the present, hunting down that soldier who appears on the screen to eliminate him. For the Russians, drones have become a real nightmare. They are silent machines that appear when you least expect it, and thanks to their size and speed, they can chase you to the most inhospitable corners. They do not tire or have compassion, and worse still, every death they cause is recorded on camera. This is not a minor detail. Unmanned aircraft are both a weapon to annihilate enemies and a constant producer of propaganda content. In this way, fear is sown in the Kremlin troops and their confidence is destroyed. Darwin's experiences, although particular, can be applied to the rest of the Ukrainian drone pilots. Today, these solitary operators who work long hours inside secret bunkers are one of the most important pillars in the defense of their country. Beyond the result of this bloody conflict, the truth is that thanks to their spectacular performance, the future of war will not be the same.
This, like for all soldiers, is their life now. Ukraine or death.
Gunshots, screams, bombs, bangs, and a lot of blood. That's what life is all about when war suddenly takes over a territory and shakes it to the core. In the delicate and raw fragment we have just seen, we can witness how the clashes between Ukraine and Russia have affected the daily life of the KFORIKI, a group of soldiers who make up a unique category of the Ukrainian militia's air assault forces. And they are the ones who lived through their worst nightmare firsthand. In today's report, we will witness a mission that this group had to face, and it did not end very well. Because, attacked by the Russian army, surrounded and with no way out, the KFORIKI were forced to fight a bloody battle of more than 14 hours, where they fought hand-to-hand for territorial position, the recovery of land, and of course their lives, and those of thousands of Ukrainian civilians. Welcome to this new episode where we will witness a true war miracle. Let's begin. June 2024. It's been 2 years since Russia and Ukraine have been fighting hand-to-hand. This invasion, initiated by the Russians on Ukrainian soil, began on February 24, 2022, and constitutes the biggest escalation in the struggle for land and independence in Volodymyr Zelensky's country. These events followed the Euromaidan in 2014, with a series of Ukrainian independence and nationalist demonstrations and riots. These began on November 21, 2013 in Kyiv's Independence Square, where large protests sedimented a unique Ukrainian patriotism. And that's where the seeds of the warriors began to germinate. In 2014, former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych made the sudden decision to suspend the association agreement between the European Union and Ukraine, and instead strengthen ties with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. Behind this decision, there was a strong pressure from Vladimir Putin, which provoked a host of complaints from Ukrainian compatriots who opposed what they considered widespread government corruption, abuse of power, and human rights violations. They longed to keep their homeland independent, without the need to maintain a link with Russia. Hence, the current clashes have such an impact on the lives of simple citizens willing to leave everything for an independent Ukraine, such as the aforementioned KFORIKI group. These men are part of a unit of Ukrainian soldiers willing to die for their beloved country. But they are not just a group of brave warriors, but they have a powerful motivation. They fight to defend their territory with tooth and claw. This common objective united them with a sense of loyalty and belonging to the group, which almost makes them a true family. Next, we will hear Sova, a commander of the KFORIKI, explain in his own voice what his mission is.
Since we've been stationed here, we've been holding the line, supporting nearby brigades, doing recon, and bracing ourselves for an enemy attack. I expect it'll come early morning, or when it's dark, or maybe during bad weather. No matter when it happens, we'll give them everything we've got.
As for the previous life of these men, it can be said that it was far from the trenches, as they are not what one would expect from a typical Ukrainian frontline soldier. Let's meet the unstereotypical members of this unit. They are Sova, Punk, Morchak, and Albert. Sova is an artist and tattoo artist from Kiev, whose real name is Roma and who is officially a commander. Punk lives up to his name, as he is of course a fan of that style of music. Morchak used to be a sailor and a navigator of Nordic waters. And finally, Albert, who used to work as an IT person, That is, he was the person in charge of creating and managing computer and technological systems. As you can see, none of them had military training. However, the fact of wanting to defend their lands and achieve Ukrainian liberation and independence from Vladimir Putin and his men has encouraged them to put on their military equipment and go to the front line with every weapon they have. After all, the last thing to be lost is hope. They are family. They belong to each other. What's more, they consider themselves to be rebels willing to kill or die for a flag, a land and a people that represents them. They are part of the KFORIKI, soldiers of unique and varied origins who love Ukraine to the core. Here we will see how Punk explains the tactics of the weapons they have, their uses and logistics, but also their setbacks.
An assault rifle isn't much use against anything other than infantry. With the PKM, you can at least engage lightly armored vehicles. Maybe even try to penetrate the rear of a BMP. We've got armor-piercing rounds we captured from the Russians for BMPs, BRDMs, but they won't stop a tank.
We are left with this last sentence: you cannot stop the tanks. It is very important to understand how this group of men, so lethally prepared, could have been crossed by the adversities that we are going to see. The KFORIKI take refuge under a plot of land with an old underground structure covered with cloth and that functions as a home and containment for each of the soldiers. This is position number 1, the shelter. Now the second is the yard, an intermediate terrain where there is a kind of shelter, but which also serves as a runway between the village and its backup places. This is where they take cover behind enemy lines. However, these shelters are not made of steel, so they are easily permeable to enemy attacks. And in fact, it made them an easy target within the vicinity of the village that the KFORIKI wanted to recover. One cold night, this group of soldiers armed to the teeth went out to hunt Russian enemies while the unit of the Black Sea Defense Group, or BSDG, for its acronym in English, stayed in the shelter, the #1 post, as a backup force. Meanwhile, the KFORIKI ran in the dark, advancing towards the enemy, stalking like predators their prey. At 4 in the morning, the terrifying sounds of the bombs began to roar. The walls of the shelter trembled. The entire structure began to. The ground beneath them began to shake, as did the ground beneath them, which slowly filled with water. But that was only a brief prelude. The trouble had only just begun. One of the soldiers of the Black Sea Defense Group, Gaba, received a radio call from Sova with a message urging them into action. The tanks were on their way.
Нужна твоя поддержка, нужна твоя поддержка.
Плюс. Куда поддержка? Куда?
Нужна поддержка в плане противотанковых. Нужна поддержка в плане противотанковых.
In this very fragment, the fear of an attack became a tangible reality. The confrontation was imminent. The enemy troops were arriving with heavy artillery, and they, the KFORIKI, could not hold them off for long. After the call for help, Sova left a clear message to the BSDG soldiers. The enemy troops were coming to attack brutally. Thus, the KFORIKI were hit hard by storms, a type of assault on Russian convoys carried out on the ground to carry out and lower the heads of enemy soldiers. No one was safe. Therefore, while Sova's team tried at all costs to resist the arrival of the tanks, Gaba and his team prepared an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade. Equipped with all this, the BSDG went out to hunt Russian enemies in order to help and rescue their friends, the KFORIKI. In the following fragment, you will be able to witness this terrible confrontation. Everything was chaos. In the absolute solitude of the night, these men went out to face their powerful enemies with only one objective: to reach the next combat position and help their comrades. Despite the fact that they were running out of ammunition and the disadvantage that this implied, Gaba and his men went out with courage, moved by that impulse, and started firing.
Last hope.
With little ammunition but a lot of will, the BSDG group managed to meet up with Sova and his men in combat. Together and more than brothers, these soldiers set out to hunt down the Russian enemies. The only way out of this situation was through open terrain where the crossfire would be the brutal protagonist. Screams, insults, confusion, and darkness. This was the setting for the hard night they would have to face. Next, we will see the precise moment when these men give one last great fight to their enemies.
Малыш, малыш, сова. Малыш, малыш. Супер. Малыш, малыш.
The fight never had a moment of rest, neither did the men, and each fought a battle like no other. In this clip, we'll see how Punk started the shooting while Sova took his grenade, and with strategy began a powerful counteroffensive.
У меня легкая в руку, сова. Легкая.
Then he's injured.
Все будет хорошо, пацаны. Я вас люблю.
Despite the physical consequences, there was a fighting spirit that was never lost. They were brothers in war. After several hours of this battle in front of enemy lines, the day came, and what was previously hidden now became clear and evident. Each of the Ukrainian soldiers with admirable calm knew how to understand the game of war and plan their survival strategies. By morning, the shots and grenades had decreased considerably, and while a leader looked after the rear, the other warriors could rest, hydrate, reflect on the steps to follow, and rearm themselves. Only one of the men was wounded. He had lost his hearing because of the incessant roar of the bombings, but even so, his head had to be cool because they still had one more feat to accomplish. Behind enemy lines, 3 tanks and various threats were approaching, and when everything seemed to be calm, a burst of gas surrounded them, anticipating what would come next. A more severe attack and certainly much worse. This was not over. By mid-morning and covered under El Refugio or La Yarda, hiding places 1 and 2 respectively, the Keifariki and the BSDG had to activate their defense lines, and thus be able to fight their Russian enemies who with tanks were ready to go for everything. So much so that they had blocked the roads to position themselves in front of the Ukrainian soldiers and thus enclosed them more and more, without remorse or mercy. Now, shielded on the same ground of 2 opposing houses, the Russians and Ukrainians fought in a shootout like no other. And while the Keifariki and the BSDG tried to coordinate drone units and call for reinforcements by radio, no soldier was nearby to come to their aid. However, after a tough battle where bullets and ammunition were heard until exhaustion, a friendly unit with a battle drone dropped an explosive that fell on the Russian lines. Thus, their enemies began to fall, wounded and without strength. The Ukrainian counterattack had been successful, but it did not mean the end of the battle. The Russians continued to outgun and outgun them. The tension increased, and while some soldiers were hurt, others were ready for the fiercest of reprisals. In this clip, we will see the last call for help that Gaba requested.
Gaba sends a final call for help over the radio.
The Russian soldiers were attacking hard, and Gaba and his men had nowhere to run. But hope was not lost. This last call for help had been heard, and the cavalry had landed. More Ukrainian soldiers arrived with heavy artillery, drones, mortars, and rocket launchers. Reinforcements had arrived from behind the uninhabited and vacant lands, ready to fight any Russian shooter they found in their path. The defense was grandiloquent, and the aerial images of the sky mined with rockets were unparalleled. After a hard attack, the village and everything around it was devastated by the incessant flare of rockets that mined the sky. Thus, Gaba and his men were able to go out and counterattack the Russian soldiers with what they had left. Little ammunition, but a lot of thirst for enemy blood. Punk had been wounded after an explosion when he was enveloped in a cloud of dust and shrapnel. However, their transfer was successful. Anyway, at the shelter and already nearing nightfall, the fire began to stalk the house where they were staying, and by sunset, the K4IKI and the BSDG were forced to go out and run for their lives. There were no enemies in sight, only fire and darkness. All thanks to the support of 2 other soldiers who had managed to block and kill the Russians. Once they found shelter, they managed to understand that they had just survived an unprecedented attack in the history of the Ukrainian militia. Although the tough fighting lasted 14 long hours, the rescues were possible thanks to the reinforcements and heavy artillery of these rebellious soldiers. They, more than anyone else, carried the weight of the weapons on their shoulders. Thus, the K4IKI and BSDG, whose dreams, now more than ever, are of war and pride for the Ukrainian motherland, became legends. Since the Russian invasion that began on February 24, 2022, the Kharkiv region in northeastern Ukraine has been one of the main combat zones. This industrial center on the border between the 2 countries became a strategic target for Moscow, prompting brutal attacks to conquer it. However, local forces have fought fiercely to resist, as in the case of the 92nd Assault Brigade, which was the protagonist of an incredible confrontation. The soldiers of this unit did not hesitate to defend their lands and fought against 2 powerful tanks and a dozen heavily armed Russians. If you want to know the story of this epic clash and the bloody dispute that has developed in Kharkiv since the beginning of the conflict, then stay with us because we are going to find out in this new video from Military Force. Put on your helmet. Here we go. Gunshots, explosions, ruined buildings, and blood. Lots of blood. That is war for the inhabitants of Kharkiv, where fighting has been intense and prolonged since the beginning of hostilities by Russia. The region has seen several phases of conflict, from direct assaults and bombings to successful counteroffensives by Ukrainian forces. The clashes there began from the first minute of the conflict that broke out in February 2022, after Russian President Vladimir Putin gave the order to carry out a special military operation in neighboring territory. In this way, after several months of tension between the 2 countries, with more than 150,000 soldiers deployed on the borders, the battle broke out. Moscow's offensive in the Kharkiv region was one of the first objectives due to its location. The Russian forces grouped in Belgorod only had to cross the political boundaries that divide the cities and use their firepower to conquer that territory. However, the Kremlin troops did not count on the strong Ukrainian resistance. Local forces had prepared for a fierce defense, knowing the strategic importance of the place, and that sparked intense fighting during the first days of the war. The location of the city, just 40 kilometers from the border, is one of the natural accesses for Russian troops who seek to project their power in eastern Ukraine. In addition, the area acts as a key logistical corridor between Moscow and other regions of its neighboring country, especially thinking about the way to the center and south of the nation. Because of this, controlling Kharkiv would allow Vladimir Putin's forces to move their soldiers, equipment and supplies more efficiently within a plan of large-scale conquest.
Щоб піти на даний час вперед, щоб здвинулась трохи лінія фронту, нам треба снаряди, нам треба заряди, нам треба пополнение людей, нам треба техника. Чтобы, если у нас этого сейчас ничего не будет, мы будем стоять на одном месте, и если противник понимает, что у нас ресурсов уже 0, то он, естественно, может спокойно на нас давить.
Kharkiv also represents a major hub for factories producing military equipment, heavy machinery, chemicals, and electronics. Thus, the industrial capacity of the region is crucial to the Ukrainian war effort, even more so if aid from allied nations is delayed. Added to this is the fact that the area is home to critical infrastructure, including power plants, railways, and communication centers. Controlling these resources is as essential as equipment when it comes to sustaining military operations over time. Given all these strategic keys and with their plans for a rapid occupation thwarted, the Russians did not hesitate to launch a massive bombing campaign on Kharkiv using artillery, rockets, and missiles. These attacks caused great destruction in residential areas, hospitals, and schools, and resulted in a high number of civilian casualties. But that was only the beginning. Between March and May 2022, fighting continued there. But as control seemed impossible, Putin's forces also sought to take neighboring towns, such as Izium, located to the south, and Kupiansk in eastern Kharkiv. The former in particular was a strategic target due to its position as a communications hub. After intense fighting and much bloodshed, Russian troops managed to capture them. However, although some areas were occupied, Ukrainian forces organized resistance tactics, including guerrilla attacks and sabotage against their enemies. In this way, they achieved sporadic victories that helped delay the advance of the Kremlin soldiers. For several months, there was sustained fighting in Kharkiv, which seemed to be wearing down both sides. But in September 2022, the men from Kiev surprised their rivals with a lightning counteroffensive, carrying out a rapid and highly coordinated attack in the region.
Нет. Да, дым. На входе там их кура. Сдавайся, долбоёб! Дивись туда. Сука, він отстрілюється. Давай, закидуй йому гранату.
The Russians were not expecting these actions, which denied them the chance to react and resist. In many cases, they were forced to hastily retreat, leaving behind large amounts of military equipment. A substantial loss in wartime, as it was not just rifles or ammunition, but huge advanced tanks such as the T-90s. During this counteroffensive, Kiev's forces quickly recaptured large areas, including key cities such as Kupiansk and Izium. The liberation of these places was seen as one of Ukraine's most significant victories in the war. However, the successes would be overshadowed by the incessant presence of their enemies, as Putin's men were not willing to give up so easily. After control of the region returned to the Ukrainians, Russian forces took the determination to bomb the place until it was reduced to rubble. Since then, artillery and missile attacks have targeted both military and civilian infrastructure, with the city of Kharkiv remaining the primary target, causing destruction and death. Throughout 2023 and into 2024, the region has been subject to such offensives as the Ukrainians carry out extensive operations to clear minefields and secure previously occupied areas. However, this latter objective is far from easy. Russian troops continue to try to regain control of different strategic points, resulting in ongoing fighting. Within these conflicts, the incredible confrontation between the 92nd Assault Brigade and powerful enemy armored vehicles took place. A group of soldiers from this unit, belonging to the unmanned vehicle attack battalion called Achilles, was in charge of defending their homeland while the men from Moscow tried to capture the city by attacking it from two directions. On one of these fronts, the Russians coordinated electronic attacks that became effective when they managed to disable the communications of Ukrainian battalions that protected the area. In this way, a relative initial success was achieved in the advance of the men from the Kremlin. However, when it came to breaking through the rival defensive lines, Putin's soldiers showed difficulties in launching assaults in an articulated manner. This is due to the lack of leadership and adequate training of the reserve troops that have joined the units due to the lack of personnel. On the other combat front, the Ukrainians encountered the advance of Russian troops from Sinkivka, a small town in the city of Kupiansk. Their task would not be easy, as in this case a dozen Kremlin fighters were marching in an overwhelming manner accompanied by 2 lethal armored vehicles. However, the 92nd Brigade had arrived from Donetsk with a clear objective, and if necessary, it would fight to the death for the Kharkov resistance.
Подъехали на позицию, будем работать по лидерам. Наводчик сел за управление Чебурашка, сейчас наводится по координатам, по которым мы будем работать. Сейчас выставляет все и начинаем пристрелочки, кидаем. Стреляем, сваливаем.
The Russians prepared their equipment, an MTLB and a BMP-3. The first of these is a Soviet-made amphibious infantry vehicle, which entered service in the late 1960s and is used as a platform for mounting various weapon systems. The second is one of the best combat armored vehicles in Putin's ranks, capable of causing great destruction. They were the perfect weapons to advance and try to assault the positions of the Ukrainian defenders. For this reason, confident in their striking power, the Russians headed into open country to deal a heavy blow to their rivals. However, the offensive was carried out in a disorganized manner, since the 12 Russian soldiers in charge of the mission did not have heavy armored vehicle cover, nor sufficient intelligence work or adequate training. In contrast, the 92nd Ukrainian Assault Brigade had carried out the necessary studies to have an accurate notion of the terrain and their rival. He was also aware that he had a better military preparation. However, he also knew that Russian weapons posed a great challenge for the unit, and if they failed, enemy troops could get close enough to launch a fierce artillery attack on Kharkiv. The pressures led to a dramatic confrontation in which the Kiev forces returned the attack using all available means, including drones and missile batteries. One of the keys to success would be a high level of interaction between the commands, that is, constant communication on how they would attack the Russians from different positions at the same time. After coordinating the actions, it was time to open fire, and that meant the end for the enemy armored vehicles. The Kremlin vehicles failed to evade the accurate Ukrainian offensive and exploded into 1,000 pieces. Both the MTLB and the BMP-3 were reduced to dust, constituting a heroic maneuver that also served to completely neutralize the dozen Moscow fighters. The local battalion was able to stop the enemy's advance and force the invaders' attack line to retreat 10 kilometers, moving away from the city of Kharkiv. However, despite the great victory, the Ukrainian troops know that they cannot waste time celebrating. It is necessary to maintain a high combat rhythm in order not to give the rivals the opportunity to gain ground again.
Утро починається, якщо є БК, я ж кажу, коли було його досталь, то ми їх могли кошмарити 24/7. Щоб враг був уставший постійно. Держати їх постійно в напряженні в такому, тому що це теж прильоти, це теж осколки, це теж контузія, теж грає на нього. Деморалізація противника. Це наша ціль.
The commitment of these men can be seen every day in their tasks in the field. However, the actions against the powerful Russian armored vehicles were a special display of character. In fact, this event earned the 92nd Assault Brigade recognition from the government of its country. President Volodymyr Zelensky himself was in charge of gathering the soldiers of the unit to present decorations. Lieutenant Denis Pilipchuk, who was in charge of the operation against the 2 infantry vehicles and their 12 Russian occupants, received the Cross of Military Merit. Meanwhile, 2 other warriors received the Order of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, and 5 more were awarded the Courage and Bravery Award. I want to ask you to convey my gratitude to your brothers in arms of the 92nd Brigade. They did not allow the enemy to pass. They are tough warriors. I am also grateful to other fighters from Kharkiv who fight in other units to defend Ukraine. Thank you and take care. I wish you strength, victory, and health, Zelensky said during the award ceremony. Like the soldiers, the Ukrainian president knows that the battle continues and the Kharkiv region will remain one of the epicenters due to its strategic importance. The Kremlin is also aware of all the advantages that can come from taking control of the city and will not stop so easily. Thus, as long as the war continues, Kharkiv will continue to be one of its main targets. This has been made clear by the incessant attacks and bombings that do not diminish despite the brutal resistance of its rival.
Ситуация сложная, да, их тоже много, и дохнут они, я не знаю, чи их клонируют, там, чи что, где они их берут, и мрет же их много, и техники много палят, все равно и прут, да, ситуация тяжелая, но все же контролируем, ну, не все, конечно, но стараемся, где можем, везде стараемся контролировать, там, здесь поднасыпать им, что-то подсбить, там, здесь арта насыпет, або пехота наступит красиво, да, я же скажу, то, я считаю, что мы сами кращие фахивцы с тем, что у нас есть, то, я думаю, это вообще...
For feeling shared by this soldier that the presence of Russian troops never ends was felt again strongly during the first days of May 2024, when Moscow dramatically opened a new front in its war against Kyiv. The offensive in the Kharkiv region developed after some of the most difficult months for Ukrainian forces, overstretched and depleted after a brutal winter campaign in other regions of the country, which caused a serious shortage of ammunition. The attacks were particularly painful for local troops, as Russia again achieved victories in areas that had already been occupied in the past and liberated by the army, such as the town of Ivanovka. As if that were not enough, the escalation of hostilities had a new impact against civilian targets, generating significant casualties among the population. However, just 2 weeks into the Russian advance on Ukraine's second-largest city, it came to a screeching halt in the face of renewed and fierce resistance from several units, including the 92nd Assault Brigade, which was joined by additional battalions sent from the south. The brutality of the local forces' response prompted President Zelensky to declare on June 8th that Russia had failed in its offensive on Kharkiv, adding that Ukrainian troops were effectively stopping and destroying the enemy in the area.
Пизда им! Їх там двох було. Закидуєш?
While the Ukrainian leader's words were welcomed by the population, the judgment on the failure or success of the operation depends on the strategic objectives with which it was conceived. And in this sense, it is difficult to say exactly how far Moscow really hoped to advance. In general, analysts agreed that Russian forces had little or no chance of encircling and entering Kharkiv. However, experts also often frame the Kremlin's offensives as an attempt to create strategic dilemmas for its rival. That is, to deepen the problems of lack of resources, both in terms of weapons and the number of personnel. As of June 13th, the mapping of the terrain showed Russian troops occupying at least 183 square kilometers of the Kharkiv region, in addition to another portion called a gray zone because it is in dispute between both sides. However, Putin's men were unable to breach the strengthened Ukrainian defenses that halted their rivals' advance some 20 kilometers outside the main city. The 92nd Assault Brigade was again key in this task, defending the front from any kind of threat, including missiles and the highly effective drones that have caused great destruction throughout the conflict.
Неважно, типа, какое направление, вот, ну, именно касается того, что моя работа за вот этих летающих плохолетов. Вот моя задача их просто напить с такой скоростью, чтобы они даже не понимали, что происходит, потому что вот его Шкода, которую он потом делает, это пи***ц. Да, это Орлан.
Following Ukrainian victories in halting the enemy advance, Kharkiv Governor Oleg Sinyagubov stated that Russian offensive operations had been scaled back with the loss of nearly 2,500 soldiers and more than 500 pieces of equipment in the area. Thus, the successful deployment of Ukrainian combat units and the stabilization of the front meant that not only would it be easier to defend the region in the future, but those units could soon be moved back to higher priority sectors to prove their high value. However, this also highlights the general personnel problems affecting the Kiev army that seem to persist, at least until the training of tens of thousands of new troops recruited under the new mobilization law is completed. At that point, Ukraine will be ready to increase its presence in the hottest areas of the war and will be able to definitively secure Kharkiv to prevent another Russian advance in the coveted region. As we come to the end of this video, we cannot forget the huge impact that these bloody clashes have had on the Ukrainian population. Because of the intensity of the fighting and the bombing, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced from the Kharkiv region. Many areas have been devastated, with essential infrastructure damaged or destroyed. In other words, it is not unreasonable to say that the war has caused a humanitarian crisis like never before seen in this area, with shortages of food, medicine, and basic services. In light of this, humanitarian organizations have worked to provide assistance, but the situation remains serious. In short, Kharkiv is one of the major axes of the conflict between the two belligerent nations. While it has been the bastion of Ukrainian identity and resistance against the Russian occupation, it is also the clearest postcard of the consequences of the war. The city seeks to remain the example of the country's sovereignty, but if it falls, it could become the greatest symbol of victory for Moscow. That's why this region carries a special weight in the fight, and sooner or later it will become the emblem of the eventual winner. Now, after learning about the most incredible clashes that took place in Kharkiv during the fierce war between Russia and Ukraine, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in the next installment of Military Force.